We'll now have our opening reading, It Matters What We Believe, by Sophia Lyon Faas. Some beliefs are like walled gardens. They encourage exclusiveness and the feeling of being especially privileged.
Other beliefs are expansive and lead the way into wilder and wider and deeper sympathies.
Some beliefs are like shadows clouding children's days with fears of unknown calamities.
Other beliefs are like sunshine, blessing children with the warmth of happiness.
Some beliefs are divisive, separating the saved from the unsaved, friends from enemies.
Other beliefs are bonds in a world community where sincere differences beautify the pattern.
Some beliefs are like blinders, shutting off the power to choose one's own direction.
Other beliefs are like gateways, opening wide vistas for exploration.
Some beliefs weaken a person's selfhood. They blight the growth of resourcefulness.
Other beliefs nurture self-confidence and enrich the feeling of personal worth.
Some beliefs are rigid, like the body of death, impotent in a changing world.
Other beliefs are pliable, like the young sapling, ever growing with the upward thrust of life.
Good morning. It's good to be with you. Today is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, a day that the nation celebrates as a federal holiday each year. This great civil rights leader and member of the clergy was guided by his faith to work on behalf of African Americans for voting rights, public accommodations, and more. Toward the end of his life, he called out for the rights of the poor, to end the war in Vietnam, as well as for racial equity. For Dr. King, his faith, his religion, offered a vision for a better world. It was an expansive view. But too often, we see people use their faith and their religion to oppress others. This idea of religious freedom matters in ways that may not dominate the news, especially if ideas about religious freedom are being used to take away rights like abortion or gay marriage. The idea of religious freedom has a long, rich history, and its meaning is still unsettled today. Tomorrow, as Mark mentioned, January 16th is Religious Freedom Day. According to the authoritative source Wikipedia, National Religious Freedom Day commemorates the 1786 Virginia General Assembly's adoption of Thomas Jefferson's landmark statute for religious freedom. That statute became the basis for the First Amendment of the Constitution and led to freedom of religion for all Americans. Religious Freedom Day has been officially proclaimed as January 16th by the president ever since 1993. Jefferson made it law in Virginia 235 years ago. The First Amendment was passed in 1791, 232 years ago, and for 30 years now, we've proclaimed it. Perhaps we need to keep proclaiming it because religious interference by government, especially by the Supreme Court, seems to be seriously on the rise. Let's look at some of this history. Here is what the Virginia statute said. I'm not quoting it, I'm paraphrasing it because the language is clearly dated. It is an act for establishing religious freedom. Jefferson wrote, God created the mind free, and even though our minds are free, we recognize that our minds can be influenced or coerced by religion. Civic and religious leaders alike make mistakes. But some of these people who have assumed leadership try to impose their individual beliefs on others. Religions have been established by these kinds of leaders all over the world and throughout history. Our civil rights are not dependent on our religious opinions any more than our opinions in physics or geometry should be. He goes on to write, therefore we can't say someone is incapable of our trust just based on their religious beliefs, nor can we deny someone their rights based on their beliefs. Therefore, the General Assembly proclaimed that no one shall be compelled to worship in a particular time or space, should not be harassed because of their beliefs, and should be free to believe whatever they want without their beliefs affecting their civil capacity. That was 1786. When I read this, I hearken back to the early Unitarians in Transylvania. Yes, werewolf country. The idea of religious freedom has deep roots in Unitarianism. Jefferson was a Unitarian, and I wonder how much he knew about this history. I don't know, and I didn't have time to look it up, but I think these ideas and writings from Jefferson are very similar to what was going on back in the 1600s. The King of Transylvania, John Sigismund, led a decade-long period of inquiry about religion in those early years of the 1600s. After much conversation and discussion in what they called a diet, which is not losing weight, it's a deliberative gathering. In this diet, they issued a statement of religious tolerance called the Edict of Torda, and that was on January 13th, 1568. The edict ends with this now often quoted paragraph. In every place the preachers shall preach and explain the gospel, each according to his understanding of it. And if the congregation like it, well. If not, no one shall compel them, for their souls would not be satisfied, but they shall be permitted to keep a preacher whose preachings they approve. No one shall be reviled for his religion by anyone, and it is not permitted that anyone should threaten anyone else by imprisonment, for faith is the gift of God. Now, the Edict of Torda allowed people to worship however they want. In fact, it encouraged that kind of exploration, and preachers could preach whatever they want, as long as they were Anglican, Roman Catholic, Unitarian, or Lutheran. Well, Jews, pagans, Buddhists, and Muslims were not really on anyone's radar back then, sadly. But this idea of religious freedom is foundational to us, and it was earth-shattering at the time. For UUs, it's an important part of our history that informs us today. Sigismund's religious advisor, Francis David, died in prison for these beliefs and is considered a martyr for his commitment to the concept of unfolding revelation and reform, the living tradition we value so much now. Michael Servetus, also from that time period in that part of the world, was burned at the stake for writing that there was no Trinity in the Bible. God was a Unitarian. UUs value religious freedom so much that it is embedded in our association bylaws in Article 2. Article 2 is that section of our UUA, Unitarian Universalist Association bylaws, about our principles that is currently being reviewed. In the face of these revisions, we have kept the language about freedom of belief relatively unchanged. So there's a draft revision that's out circulating, and here's what the draft says. Nothing herein, referring to Article 2, shall be deemed to infringe upon the individual freedom of belief, which is inherent in the Unitarian Universalist heritages, or to conflict with any statement of purpose, covenant, or bond of union used by any congregation, unless such is used as a creedal test. In expressing our beliefs, we do so in the spirit of love, in ways that further beloved community. That last sentence is what was added. In other words, congregations shall not impose a creed of beliefs on your members. You don't have to sign a statement that says what you believe. Beyond that, the association is silent on what we should believe. an idea that comes up in our principles which promote our own search for truth and our right of conscience. This idea of freedom of belief has been with us for a long time. The idea of religious freedom is also a significant part of the U.S. Constitution. It's our First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, not the second, not the fourth, or not the 10th. It's the first statement in the First Amendment, and it was influenced by Jefferson, but it was written by James Madison. The First Amendment of the Constitution prohibits the government from establishing a religion, such as they had in England. There is also a free exercise clause in the First Amendment that allows most religious practices, as long as they are not immoral, like child sacrifice maybe, or stand in the way of a compelling government interest, such as vaccination. The state cannot tell you what to believe or where to go to church, and it can't keep you from using your faith in your own life for your family's or for your community's good. I was drawn to this idea of religious freedom when I was quite young. How dare the government tell me what to believe? How dare the government interfere with how I live my life when there's no harm being done to anyone else? When I was young, I moved away from my Lutheran upbringing fairly quickly. The theology was something that I couldn't agree with. Fortunately, I had that right to be able to move away. But I became kind of a rabid atheist. I chuckle now at the advertisements that you see on TV for the Freedom from Religion Foundation, where the speaker says, "I'm Ron Reagan, avowed atheist, not afraid of burning in hell." To be able to say that in this country without coming to harm, that matters. As an avowed atheist myself those years ago, I became a bit strong-minded about the separation of church and state. Why is "in God we trust" on our money? Why are we one nation under God? The U.S. Constitution never even mentions God. I couldn't really understand why religion should be part of government at all. If the values I was raised with came from the church of my upbringing, then I would say there was some good there. Love your neighbor being top of mind for me. I also have a so-called Protestant work ethic, which isn't all bad, I suppose, if you can ignore the myth of it. I now have more nuanced appreciations for what God is and how God exists in our world, but I also firmly believed then, and still do today, that a person does not have to belong to a religion to be a good and moral person. Atheists could be just as moral as people who believed in God. Indeed, looking at what religion has done over the millennia, I wouldn't necessarily say religion has lived up to any particular set of morals either. Holy wars, land grabs, and the genocide of so-called heathens in the name of God come to mind. The Reverend Sarah Asher reminds us that other nations do not have this free faith. In many places, religion imposes laws on people using the argument that God commanded them, such as the persecution of gay people in some countries. Even in recent Unitarian history, Unitarians living in the faith's birthplace of Transylvania had to take their faith underground and worship in secret during the Cold War because there was no free exercise of religion under communist rule. And yet that faith persisted. When the wall came down, Unitarianism rose again. In some countries, even today, you might be killed for your beliefs or practices by morality police, such as women in Iran who choose not to cover their hair properly, Uyghurs displaced in China, Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. This stuff matters. The point is, people have done lots of very bad things in the name of religion, and it seems the intermingling of religion and government has a potential to be destructive. The separation of church and state and the concept of religious freedom maybe need some deeper examination and commitment. Forrest Church, a UU minister, wrote a really nice little book called The Separation of Church and State. It's a compilation of short essays and historic writings that bring to light the origins of the idea of separation of church and state and what religious freedom really means. Interestingly, the Baptists in our early U.S. history were persecuted and prosecuted for their faith. According to Forrest Church, Massachusetts Baptists were repeatedly fined, whipped, and incarcerated for faith-related offenses. One Baptist clergy member, Isaac Bacchus, was jailed because he did not pay the annual assessment imposed in support of the established congregational clergy. In other words, they were making the Baptists pay for the Congregationalist clergy. Talk about mingling church and state. I wonder if this was the basis for why churches don't have to pay taxes. Bacchus wrote that the colonies were willing to pay their taxes to England, but not willing to follow a faith that was imposed by the state. Thomas Jefferson, who is a bit of a controversial figure in history because he enslaved Africans and did not write his famous Declaration of Independence to free them. But like most human beings, he was more than one thing. For example, he began writing about the importance of freedom from religion as a safeguard against coercion, while the Baptist Bacchus emphasized freedom for religion, a freedom uncompromised by any form of state interference. In other words, the separation of church and state was to protect the church and people of faith from state religious dictates or inhibitions. Religion is not imposed on us by the state and not limited by the state. Religion is between God and people. Jefferson said, "All men shall be free to profess by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities." These ideas are embedded in the First Amendment of the Constitution, the first and foremost correction of the original document, the first act to remind us of the value of religious freedom. I'll read just the first part. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It goes on. So the government shall not establish a religion or prevent anyone from practicing it the way they want. Freedom from and freedom for. But it obviously doesn't mean the church has no influence over the state. Religious freedom is the freedom to believe whatever you want without any interference from the state. But there is an unstated aim that the state, the lawmakers, need to be free to legislate without religious interference. Is that also present? For Dr. King, his faith drove his justice work and changed laws. And that feels okay to me. There is a compelling interest to use one's faith to guide one's own actions and to expand rights rather than restrict them. There's also a compelling state interest to protect people from harm, as in the Jim Crow South, not to restrict religious rights. Religious freedom is the free exercise of religion, unless the exercise is against the state's interest. That feels like a big loophole. What is a compelling moral interest of the state? I've always wondered about the concept of playing God as a state interest. Do any of you remember Terry Schiavo? She was a young woman who was resuscitated after having a massive heart attack. She was in a persistent vegetative state, and her husband said she would not want to live that way. He fought for years to get her feeding tube removed. People would say removing her feeding tube was like playing God. I kind of saw it the other way around, that feeding her artificially was playing God. And assisted suicide has not yet become very widespread. Michigan's own Dr. Kevorkian was even jailed for assisting someone with suicide at their wish. For some religions, suicide is seen as a grave sin. Is religion holding us back? Things rose to bizarre heights, in my opinion, after the Affordable Health Care Act was passed. It had provisions that health insurance should provide certain kinds of reproductive health care, such as birth control. And yet the religious right did not want their businesses to have to provide that care if it was on their dime. In the Hobby Lobby Supreme Court case, the court ruled against birth control access in a 5-4 decision, with the majority of the justices saying that Hobby Lobby and other closely held corporations could deny birth control coverage to their employees. The ruling set a new precedent. It feels like Hobby Lobby is interfering with my rights, and the court said it was just fine to use religious grounds in that way. The U.S. Supreme Court banned school-sponsored prayer in public schools in a 1962 decision, saying that it violated the First Amendment. Students are allowed to meet and pray on school grounds as long as they do it privately and don't try to force others to do the same. But in another case, very recently, Kennedy versus the Bremerton School District, it involved an appeal by a public high school coach who claimed religious discrimination under the Free Exercise Clause. You see, he was fired for refusing to stop kneeling in prayer at the football field's 50-yard line immediately following every game. The school directed him to stop leading his team in pre- and post-game prayer. Well, he lost the first time around, but the coach appealed it, and the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, joined the case and asserted that the coach's claims fail because the First Amendment's established clause forbids his on-field prayer practice, which pressured the students on the team to participate. This is a coach, an official, and a leader, very publicly demonstrating that his players were supposed to do according to his faith. The ADL lost. Also, private religious schools are now getting more and more support from the state by getting vouchers that use state money for tuition, something that was not allowed years ago. In this 21st century, we must be vigilant to the role the government is playing. The religious right is using religious belief as the rationale for restricting all kinds of rights. The right to privacy over our own bodies, the right to use birth control, the right to pray when and how we want without coercion, and the right to receive services regardless of religion. Think about the wedding cake issues for gay marriage. We must also do our utmost to stop religious persecution by non-state actors as well, such as the terrorism and murder of Muslims and Jews. We have seen too much hatred and violence in the name of God. How is it that religious freedom is being co-opted by the religious right to restrict our rights? How can we allow that to happen? How is it that religious freedom is being used not to encourage rights and freedoms like what Dr. King promoted, and instead is being used to remove freedoms and privacy? We must develop our vision as a people of free faith, bold enough to stand in the breach when religion seeks to oppress and interfere with our rights and the rights of other religious people. We need to act to keep religion free. This is our vision. May it be so.